From the world of politics.
So the tweet looked to me like the opposite of what we really needed at that moment, which was a de-escalation.
To the world of business.
By spring, by even early winter 2023, either wages will have continued to slow their growth or they'll have picked up again. If they've picked up again, then the Fed's going to have no choice but to raise well past 4% to 5.5%, and we'll get a recession.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, we have two U.S. presidents in the news today. One, the current president, Joe Biden, who's come down with COVID, we learned yesterday. The other, the former president, Trump, who was very much the subject of yet another hearing, this one in prime time, of the House Select Committee and what happened on January 6th. To bring us up to date on both, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Anne-Marie Hordern. So, Anne-Marie, first of all, start with President Biden, COVID-19. How's he doing?
Well, we heard from his doctor, Kevin O'Connor. What we've learned is that the president's symptoms have improved. He did have a fever last night. He was treated with Tylenol, and that does seem to have cleared that up. We've also gotten another picture from the president. He is tweeting about a bill he signed regarding baby formula and the lifting of tariffs for those imports. Interesting, though, David, in this picture, he is wearing a mask. This was the subject of a number of questions yesterday in the briefing with the press secretary and the White House COVID coordinator about the distance between the president, who was shown maskless at his desk in the residence yesterday, and the photographer. And you heard the press secretary say that he took his mask off for the photo because they thought that his face should be shown to the American people that he's still working. Clearly today they decided potentially maybe it's better, since he is COVID positive, that he wears that mask.
So, Anne-Marie, that handles 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Let's go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill. Last night we heard some fairly dramatic testimony, at least I thought, in front of the House Select Committee. Give us a report on what you think we heard.
Yeah, it was dramatic. A lot of fireworks. We've learned a lot about what President Trump was doing or was not doing during those hours on the assault on the Capitol. They made these assertions at the committee that also he didn't want a log of what was being done. The White House photographer was really discouraged from taking photos. We've also learned that the president was not making any calls from law enforcement to the military to try to intervene to stop the assault on the Capitol. And what gave it a lot of credibility last night, David, is the fact that these were individuals that were either part of President Trump's internal White House staff or worked on his campaign. So they were credible in the sense that they were working for the president at this moment. A lot of questions now remain. One is what's going to happen with the next subpoenas. We heard from Representative Cheney saying that the dam has been broken and new subpoenas are out, so you could expect some down the line. But also, what does this mean for the Justice Department? Merrick Garland just on Wednesday said that no one is above the law, but of course there has been no charges to the former president.
Okay, thank you so much to our Washington correspondent. She's Anne-Marie Hordern. We want to stay on the really substantial agenda these days in Washington and turn to Representative John Katko. He's Republican of New York, and he is the ranking member of the House Homeland Security Committee. Thank you so much, Congressman, for being back with us. I want to talk to you about Homeland Security and particularly immigration. But before that, I want to remind everybody you have extensive experience as a federal prosecutor. So you know what it is to prosecute crimes. I know you voted, as I recall, for impeaching President Trump for his conduct on January 6th. He was not convicted. Is there any further legal consequences, do you think, for the former president coming out of these hearings?
Well, of course, there's always the potential for legal consequences. And what I heard last night, and what I've heard in the weeks preceding that, the hearing last night, was things I was aware of when I decided to be the first Republican to cast my vote for impeachment of the president. And I didn't reach that lightly. I analyzed the evidence. I thought there was sufficient evidence for impeachment. The question you're asking is whether there's sufficient evidence for criminal conduct to be charged against the former president. And that, I think we're far away off from that, especially given the fact that this commission doesn't have what you might say a balanced view of things, because they don't have allies of the president presenting their side of the story. So before you ever got to the point of criminal allegations, you would have to take a look at all the entire playing field, not just the things that are damning to the president, but some of the things that may cut the other way. And that's something we really haven't seen in these hearings very much.
When you talk about evidence, Congressman, some of the evidence we heard last night that at least I found chilling was the communications going on among the Secret Service agents up there on Capitol Hill, where they were literally asking people to call their families and say goodbye for them. They were that concerned with what's going on. Things that were being heard in the White House by members of the National Security Council. At the same time, it appears the committee will not get evidence. We have some text from the Secret Service. As a prosecutor, what do you do with that when it appears that evidence has been destroyed for whatever reason?
Well, you got to find out if, in fact, that evidence existed, and then if it was destroyed, who destroyed it and why. And that's always a concern when you're a prosecutor, is to, if there's relevant evidence that's been destroyed, why was it destroyed, and who's responsible for that? That, you know, if there's evidence that's missing that was destroyed, and it turns out that that evidence was helpful to your case, you can always get an instruction from the court, and you can have negative inferences drawn from that. We don't know where we're at with that yet. There seems to be some conflicting reports, but it's certainly something that needs to be looked into, because I think it's a critical piece of the puzzle.
So, Congressman, let me go to your responsibilities as ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. There's a lot of issues about immigration, have been for a long time, but particularly right now we're hearing from some Northeast mayors, particularly New York and Washington, D.C., complaining about some of the busing of some of the people who have come across the border without documentation, busing from the Southwest. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's ironic that mayors of heavily Democratic cities who are fully supportive of basically the open border policy of the Biden administration are now complaining because immigrants, illegal aliens, are coming into their cities. And one thing's for sure, we need to make clear, there's been no busing of any illegal aliens in New York City. The only place they've been bused into is into Washington, D.C., to make a point. What has happened is non-government organizations, 501c3 type charity organizations, have contracted with the Biden administration to ship illegal aliens all over the country once they come across the border and are processed. Those are the people that are sending the illegal aliens into these communities. I think it's ironic that they're complaining now about a few thousand people in their city, whereas you look at the cities along the border and the counties along the border, they have to cut their budgets by a tremendous amount for their traditional services just to deal with the tremendous influx coming across the border, and they're not getting any help from the federal government. So this is a crisis that we have to get under control. And I'm all for legal immigration, I'm all for immigration reform, but we've got to do it in the right way, and having an open border is not the way to do it.
Any prospect of that as a practical matter, Congressman? It's a crisis, as you describe it, but it's a crisis that's been going on for a long time now.
Yeah, and listen, I'm head of what's called the American Security Task Force, and our job is to have a legislative agenda ready on January 3rd when Republicans hopefully take over Congress. And one of the components of that is a border security. And we're going to have an entire package ready to go on January 3rd. And then the president's going to have to start making some decisions whether he's going to be willing to play ball with Republican-controlled Congress and possibly Republican-controlled Senate, or is there going to be stalemate and gridlock? I think the president's going to have to bend. If he does, we're going to have a more secure border.
Finally, Congressman, let's turn to something that I know is important to you. That's that CHIPS Act, which seems to be revived in what they call now a skinny CHIPS Act version, a little trimmed back. But give us a sense of what's in there and why it's so important to you.
Well, it's not so skinny. It's pretty substantial. But what it really does is recognize that chip manufacturing, especially high-end chip manufacturing, is not just an economic concern. It's a national security concern. And if China decides to go into Taiwan tomorrow, they will control 90% of the high-end chip manufacturing. What does that mean to the United States? We can't produce our weapons. We can't give weapons to Ukraine that will help them fight Russia. We can't produce high-end machinery. We can't do a lot of things that these chips are for. So what this act does is bring a lot of that manufacturing back through incentives. And the economic positivities of this are incredible. I'll give you one example. In central New York, there might be a manufacturing facility built that will be upwards of $100 billion in investments in chip manufacturing if this bill goes through. That's just one of many sites around the country. So whatever this bill costs, many-fold more is going to redound back to the communities and economic development, and in addition to having better national security for our country.
Is it enough to make us competitive with China and, for that matter, with Europe as well? And how long will it take?
Well, it will absolutely make us more competitive, and certainly from a supply chain standpoint, much more secure. And listen, if we don't do it, the European Union is going to do it. And in the Asian markets will do it. If we do this, these companies are coming here, and they will be here for the long term, and they will be investing stunning amounts of money that we really have never seen in the United States before. So it's a win-win situation. And I understand people's concern about quote unquote corporate giveaways. These are incentives like you do anytime in any business deal to incentivize people and businesses to come and play in your backyard. And that's what we need from an economic standpoint and from a national security standpoint. To me, it's a no-brainer.
Okay, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Congressman. That's
Sure.
Congressman John Katko, Republican of the state of New York. And we have some breaking news now, just breaking across the Bloomberg a short time ago, and that is Volkswagen CEO Herbert Deese is going to leave the post. He's going to be replaced by Mr. Bluma, who will be his successor. So an icon, really, in the automotive industry. Herbert Deese is stepping down as the head of Volkswagen. Coming up, we're going to look ahead to next week's Fed rate decision with Tyler Goodspeed of the Hoover Institution. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. In the UK, a new poll shows Foreign Secretary Liz Truss extending her lead over former Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak in the race to be the next Prime Minister. According to a YouGov survey of Conservative Party members, 62% said they would vote for Truss and 38% would vote for Sunak. An earlier poll this week had Truss leading by 19 points. President Biden's symptoms from COVID-19 improved overnight after his first full day on the Pfizer drug Paxlovid. That's according to his doctor. Mr. Biden tested positive for coronavirus on Thursday, reporting mild symptoms that included a runny nose, dry cough, and fatigue. The president is isolating in the White House residence. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is warning that the U.S. can't keep relying on Taiwan for semiconductors. In a virtual speech to the annual Aspen Security Forum, Secretary Raimondo said Congress needs to pass legislation to support the domestic production of high-end computer chips. She called the $50 billion package, her words, a Sputnik moment for America. Congressman Lee Zeldin of New York, a Republican candidate for governor of the state, was attacked at a campaign event outside of Rochester on Thursday. A man with what's being described as a sharp object confronted Zeldin and assaulted him before he was subdued. Congressman Zeldin was not injured. The 43-year-old suspect has been charged. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, markets still are caught between the rock of inflation and the hard place of a possible recession. To give us a sense of how we're doing in navigating between those two, we turn now to Tyler Goodspeed. He's Hoover Institution Fellow and former acting chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. So thank you so much, Tyler, for being with us. How are we doing on inflation in particular? Has it peaked yet, do you think?
It's always good to talk with you, David. I think we have probably reached a local maximum because there's a lot of disinflationary pressure that's going to be coming online from inventory disinvestment, from freight rates have been dropping, spot freight rates have been dropping. And then also, I think that we're going to start seeing a lot more consumer weakness, and that'll all be disinflationary. But when you look at a lot of these inertial measures of inflationary pressure, sticky CPI, trimmed mean CPI, weighted median CPI, those are all showing inflation rising at annualized rates of 8 to 10%. So there's a long way from 8 to 10% down to 2%.
We're going to get some new data next week, and I know you'll be watching it closely, but both the PCE as well as the Employment Cost Index. What will you be looking for in those numbers?
Well, what I'll be looking for is whether we're continuing to see a broadening of the underlying inflationary pressure. So as you know, services are 5 times as important as goods in the calculation of CPI and roughly that for PCE. And the biggest component there is shelter. And right now, shelter is rising at an annualized rate of almost 8%. So that's not going to be too impacted by whatever happens to the price of oil. So I'm definitely going to be looking at that.
How are we doing on growth? We got PMI numbers in today, and actually we dipped below a 50 on both services and composite for PMI. Are you worried about that?
I had been in the camp of expecting the recessionary risk to really peak next year rather than this year. But I have to say, it's increasingly looking like we are in the foothills of a recession. So we had a negative quarter in Q1, actually a fairly big negative quarter. I mean, a 1.6% annualized rate of decline. And when I'm adding up the components for Q2, I'm struggling to see how we get to a positive number because, yes, the consumer spending growth was probably still positive, but slowing. I don't see exports having recovered. I don't see inventory investment having recovered. Housing is weakening substantially. Business investment will likely have weakened in response to rising interest rates. So I think we're probably looking at a negative quarter for Q2. Now, does that mean a recession started? One would be hard pressed to call it a recession when you've been averaging monthly job gains of 400,000. But the growth picture definitely appears to be dimming.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to ask about, Tyler. I'm glad you pointed us there, which is, can we have a recession without a lot more unemployment than we're seeing right now?
Well, I guess that sort of gets into how you define one. So the National Bureau of Economic Research defines a recession on the basis of depth, duration, and diffusion. How broad-based is the decline? And I think that, if we had a 1%, 2%, 1.5% decline in Q2, you add that to the decline in Q1, and that's actually a fairly substantial recession. That's bordering on, peak to trough of almost 1%. And so that's fairly deep. It would be 2 quarters, so you kind of have the duration. But in terms of diffusion, I don't think it would meet the bar for classification as a recession if we still had a really strong labor market. But unfortunately, the labor market does seem to be, if you look around the edges, there does seem to be some cause for concern. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Tyler, you've spent a lot of time looking at the history of economics, and I wonder, is it also pretty unusual to go into a recession given the fact that we have so much money on the balance sheet, both company balance sheets as well as household balance sheets? They still have a lot of money to spend.
They still have a lot. That's an excellent point, David. They still have a lot of money to spend. And it's actually not just companies and households. It's also state and local governments, because in a recessionary environment, you can also often get some layoffs or deferred hiring by state and local governments. So those healthy balance sheets are definitely a source of strength if indeed we are heading into a recession.
So what can be done about this? Obviously, we're all looking at the Fed. We're going to have an FOMC meeting next week. We're all counting on them. But is there fiscal policy that could address this, such as, for example, higher taxes?
So the higher taxes that I've seen talked about generally focus on companies, big corporations, and also on high net worth individuals. And that's not going to do a whole heck of a lot to really cool inflationary pressure. I think to cool inflationary pressure, you would have to be raising taxes in a much more broad-based way, and I don't think that's advisable as you head into a recession. I would actually be focused on tax measures that would incentivize increased labor force participation, that would incentivize domestic capital formation, because then you're going to be mobilizing supply so that you can ease some of the pressure on the inflationary front.
Give me an example. Is that childcare?
Well, actually, I think it would be great if the child care provisions that were implemented in the 2017 Trump tax cuts were made permanent. So in the 2017 tax cuts, we actually doubled the size of the child tax credit, and we expanded eligibility for it. We expanded refundability of it, but crucially, that refundability only applied to earned income. So it effectively acted as a subsidy for employment or reemployment. So I think making a measure like that permanent would certainly be helpful. And also just signaling that some of those marginal income tax rate reductions and some of the full expensing of equipment investment, signaling that those will be made permanent rather than allowed to expire, might help to incentivize folks who maybe left the labor force to reenter.
Okay, thank you so much. Always great to have you with us. That's Tyler Goodspeed, Hoover Institution Fellow and former acting chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Later in the program, we're going to get the White House views on the economy from National Economic Council Director Brian Deese. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to take a look at the markets right now, and for that we turn to Kriti Gupta. So Kriti, as I look at it, we've got equities down and also yields down at the same time.
You know, it's interesting. When we see something like this, immediately you think this is some sort of flight to haven. But I would argue that these are two completely different stories. The cross-asset currents here, well, they're not on the same page. So let's start with the equities market, because a lot of that is coming from Snapchat earnings and Twitter earnings, social media. And ordinarily, I think on the surface, it's fair to say social media is kind of its own universe. But I think it's a little bit of a macro proxy as well, in that if you are losing advertising revenue, it's because there is a lack of faith in the consumer, that even if you do use that advertising revenue, the consumer isn't going to be spending, the consumer isn't going to be buying. It was the same concerns in 2020, the same concerns in 2021 when we were talking about supply chain issues, for example, where people were saying, we don't even have the product to advertise, so why bother advertising at all? But this time it's coming on the demand side. So to see Snapchat talk about those headwinds, Twitter talk about those headwinds, and then Snapchat go as far as to not even issue third quarter guidance, you can really see that has spooked the market, with Snapchat shares, I think, down about 40% from their peak, Twitter shares under pressure, and of course, following the entire trend this week of tech people slowing down hiring.
So as you say, it could be because we don't have faith in the consumer. Back in the days when I was at ABC managing things, you also saw that companies cut back their advertising spend first. I mean, the two are related, but it's basically, is it companies deciding they can't be expansionary right now? They got to pull in their troops a little bit.
Right, which almost explains what's going on in the bond market, but perhaps a separate driver when you look at the eco data, for example. We got some pretty weak PMIs here in the United States, some weak PMIs overnight in Germany as well. We did start to get a little bit of expansionary territory in the UK and in France as well, so that is good news that not the entire Eurozone is in trouble, taking out the UK, of course, not part of the Eurozone. But the point is you are starting to see some weakness and you are starting to see some contraction, and immediately off those moves, you're seeing bids into the U.S. Treasury market, which would explain this 8 basis point move lower on the 10-year yield.
So where we're going to end up the week? This is Friday after all. Are we going to have an up week in the equities or not?
Well, right now we are still up about 2.6% on the week, so it would take a lot to change that. But anything can happen, as we know, in the last couple of weeks.
Well, there's been a lot of movement on Fridays in particular, right?
There absolutely has. So it would have to take about 2.6% further dropping to erase this week's gains.
Well, don't misunderstand me. I'm not rooting for it. I'm just asking the question. Okay. Thanks so much to Kriti Gupta. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets, where she will be anchoring. Coming up, Brian Deese, National Economic Council Director, will join us to give us his perspective and the White House's perspective on what is going on right now in the economy, both with respect to inflation and the prospects of a recession. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word. Mark?
David, Russia and Ukraine have reached a deal aimed at releasing millions of tons of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. If implemented, it would mark a major step toward shoring up global food supplies. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke ahead of a signing ceremony in Istanbul.
Let there be no doubt, this is an agreement for the world. It will bring relief for developing countries on the edge of bankruptcy and the most vulnerable people on the edge of famine. And it will help stabilize global food prices, which were already at record levels even before the war, a true nightmare for developing countries.
Secretary General Guterres says the accord involves shipments from 3 Ukrainian ports, including Odessa. In Italy, an election will be held September 25th in the wake of the resignation of Prime Minister Mario Draghi. President Sergio Mattarella dissolved parliament and officially called for the vote following Draghi's move. A center-right coalition is currently leading in the polls. Judges at the United Nations highest court have dismissed preliminary objections by Myanmar to a case alleging the Southeast Asian nation is responsible for genocide against the Rohingya ethnic minority. The decision establishing the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction cleared the way for the case brought in 2019 by the small African nation of Gambia to go ahead. In China, President Xi Jinping is dealing with a new type of protest. Tens of thousands of home buyers are refusing to pay their mortgages because developers have quit building their homes. Authorities are moving to put down public displays of discontent, but President Xi may make concessions, such as letting those homeowners temporarily halt payments without penalties. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, those of us at Bloomberg spend a lot of time going over the facts and figures of the U.S. economy. But we turn now to somebody whose job it is to really make sure he knows what's going on in the economy and make some plans for it. He's Brian Deese. He's White House Director of the National Economic Council. Brian, thank you so much for taking time today. It strikes me your job is busy all the time, but you're in a particularly busy season right now. We just got PMI numbers in, which went below 50 for services and composite. And then next week, we got an FOMC decision. We've got the ECI, the Employment Cost Index numbers, and we got PCE. What will you be looking for? How do you look at those numbers?
Well, it's a busy season, and it's a busy season legislatively as well. We're obviously looking at all of those numbers as they come in. I think that, and we will get a second quarter GDP next week as well, wedged in between the numbers that you identified. As we're looking at those numbers, and as we're looking at the numbers coming in, what we see is a transition that many anticipated, and in fact many called for. It is consistent with the Fed tightening cycle, and it's a transition from a historically strong and also bumpy economic recovery to a transition where our goal is to get to a more stable and steady pathway of growth. And so what you see in that transition is that some of the most accelerated and aggressive parts of the recovery are coming down a bit. You see that, for example, in the housing market, and you see different dynamics going on. For example, within consumer expenditure, you see a shift from goods to services, and we're seeing some resilience in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. For example, on the labor market side, where even as you're seeing some reduction in the overall pace of hiring, we're still operating at historically strong levels. So really what we're seeing is that transition, and what we're keeping a close eye on is both the pace of that transition and what the impact is for typical working families as we navigate through this transition.
So as you said, I think it was strong and stable growth is what your goal is. At the same time, you've got a Scylla and Charybdis. You can run it too hot and get too much inflation. You run it too cold and get a recession. What is the White House game plan? I know we've heard from you and others, inflation is really your top priority right now. But what is your game plan in dealing with inflation without tipping us over into recession? Yeah, well, look, we do know that inflation is a global phenomenon right now. Countries around the world are dealing with it. So our approach is to approach this using the unique sources of economic strength that the United States has. And I think it is fair to say that the United States is better positioned than virtually any other country to go at this challenge because of the strength of our labor market recovery, because household balance sheets remain historically in a strong position. So our strategy is to go everywhere and use every lever we can to bring prices down, but to do so in a way that doesn't have to give up all of the economic gains that we've made. Gas prices and energy, we've been working that issue for some time. We're seeing some helpful moderation on that front. Gas prices down about 60 cents from their peak already here in the United States. But we need to do more, and we need to take actions like the action that's in front of Congress right now to pass a historic innovation and semiconductor investment bill that would help make sure that we can increase the supply of semiconductors, secure the supply chain of semiconductors. We know how critical that is both to the economy and our national security, but also to easing price pressures across the economy in areas like the automotive sector. And we've been following that CHIPS Act, I guess is what they call it these days. It's had different names pretty carefully. And it looks like that may well get done. Not done yet, but looks like it may well get done. At the same time, that raises a question about the time horizon for your game plan at the White House for the economy. If that kicks in, it's not going to affect, I don't think, chips right away. It takes a while to make all those fabs, as they're called. What do you have in short, medium, and long term? How do you look at that question as you plan out how you want to have economic policy work in this country? It's a great question. As we think about easing those price pressures, we do think about it in the short, medium, and long term, and there are actions we can take across that spectrum. I mentioned gas prices. That's a place where we're seeing real-time actions have real-time implications, and those gas prices, that 60 cents is happening right now in the economy right now.
But we also want to put in place and lay the foundation for investments that will start to pay dividends and reduce price pressures across time as well. Semiconductors are a great example. People often say to me, well, once that passes, it'll take 6, 12 months, 18 months for investment to start. We should have taken this step a year ago. And we should take it now. And the fact that it may take some time to is actually even further reason why we should take those steps now. Another great example of that is on the housing supply side. We have a really aggressive strategy to try to encourage to build out the supply of affordable housing across the country. That's a decades-long problem in the United States. We are chronically have too little supply of affordable housing in regions of the country where we need it. We have a strategy to move out across that will play out over the next 12 to 24 months. But the faster and the sooner that we get that, we can also send a signal and send some stability for private capital that ultimately is necessary for these types of investments, whether it's in semiconductors or housing supply or the like.
So between the, if I can call it short term, like the gasoline prices, which you have pointed out have been coming down now, I'm sure in part because of the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, on the short term on the one hand, and the longer term that you identify that could even be decades long, what do you have that might help with the inflation between now and, for example, just to pick a date, November?
Well, the most salient price out there, and it's the price that people see every day and interact with, is gas prices. And obviously, we have tools there. We're going to stay focused on that. And if markets are any indication, we should see additional reductions in the price of gas at the pump. There are other steps that we could take right now. Congress is also going to consider reforms to prescription drugs pricing and health insurance premiums, that if we actually legislate and enact something in the next couple of weeks, it would do things like avoid 13 million people this fall from seeing their healthcare premiums go up. It would help to cap the cost of insulin, for example, at $35 a month. Those are steps that we could also take that would have an impact here in the short term. But even as we do that, I do want to underscore that the goal here of our economic policy is to put working families in a better and stronger position than they were not just 6 months ago, but pre-pandemic, when a lot of the things about our economy weren't working for them. And so the strength of the labor market, the wage growth we're seeing, we want to continue that progress as well, because ultimately that's going to make a big difference for families across the medium term.
Brian, how does trade fit into your overall game plan for dealing with the economy, getting growth, but at the same time keeping prices down? A lot of talk about Chinese tariffs. That's certainly included in what's involved. I understand you're not the trade representative. You're not the Secretary of Commerce. But at some point, freer trade does overall bring down costs and actually really promotes growth, does it not?
Well, look, what we have seen in this crisis and what certainly animates President Biden's approach to international economic policy is that we do benefit from stronger and more durable trading relationships with our allies and partners, but we also benefit from more resilient supply chains and more durable agreements that can actually generate durable progress for communities and workers here in the United States. And we have had an approach to trade historically that has under-focused in both the downsides of lean supply chains that have embedded risk and embedded costs, and also in trade policies that actually end up gutting out and hollowing out parts of this country. So we've got to get this right, certainly by doing so by working and developing more close arrangements with allies and partners, but also not ignoring that there are those costs and there are those realities in the global economy. That's one of the reasons that this president has put supply chains so high on his agenda internationally. And in fact, our Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, will be having a supply chain summit later this month on exactly that topic. Getting more secure supply chains will be good for American companies. It'll bring prices down. We know that as well.
Fair enough, Brian. And I think most CEOs you talk to talk about redoing their supply chain. But last one, what is the single thing most important that the White House has done to promote nearshoring and friendshoring, as I just heard Secretary Yellen refer to it? What's the most important thing you've done to really promote that?
Well, look, at the core of that is demonstrating to the world and demonstrating to businesses in the United States and around the world that we have the capacity to invest in ourselves and to put in place an industrial strategy that actually uses public investment to leverage private capital here and around the world. And if you look at what this president has done, by passing not only the most significant economic package since FDR, but also the most significant infrastructure investment since Eisenhower, we are beginning to lay the foundation for the United States continuing to be an innovative place to invest. And we're seeing that in terms of inbound investment into the United States. Passing this CHIPS bill would really be rocket fuel to that effort.
Okay, Brian, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this. Brian Deese, he's director of the National Economic Council. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The war in Ukraine continues with more developments even today as they're getting close to a deal with Turkey and Ukraine and Russia to allow grain to come out of the Black Sea. We turn now to somebody who knows the situation in Europe terribly well. Bailey Hutchison is former U.S. ambassador to NATO, former Republican senator from Texas, and right now out in Aspen where they have that annual gathering of the national security elite, which certainly the ambassador is part of. So, Kay, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, give us some news out of Ukraine. What do we know about Ukraine, and what actually has been discussed out there at the symposium?
Well, of course, the big thing for today is that agreement that will allow the grain to leave Ukraine. That is huge because especially the countries like Africa that depend on the Ukrainian grain, it was getting very serious that there would be a famine as well as all of our other issues. So that is huge, and giving credit to the UN and Turkey, President Erdogan, for pulling that together. And there will be implementation issues to assure that there are no arms involved, et cetera. But it's a very, very big step for humanitarian aid and very pleasing. On the other hand, we've heard a lot from our CIA director, the UK CIA director as well, and the others in Jake Sullivan's coming in today, talking about the other issues that we're working on, both with Russia and then, of course, how we deal with China has come up a lot, wanting to try to keep the doors open, but being very watchful of the pretty rough tactics they are using in some of the places where they have Belt and Road initiatives and most certainly trade that you were discussing earlier. You have to have free and fair trade, not just trade.
So, okay, let's come back to Ukraine for a moment, if I could, and particularly the CIA director, also the director of MI6 you heard from. I wasn't sure what I made out of it. On the one hand, it sounded like they both agreed the Russians have taken a lot of losses. They may even be pausing a little bit in what they're doing there. At the same time, it wasn't clear whether the Ukrainians had what they need to really turn the tide.
I think the Ukrainians do not feel that they yet have the arms and the amount of arms that they need, because of course they're going through it very fast. But we are promising more, and our allies are promising more of the HIMARS, the longer range weapons that they need to really beat back this Russian horrific invasion of their country. So they do need more. But I will say that both the directors agreed that the pause means that Russia has taken these casualties and they are now having to reach deeper into their military with the more experienced forces, and that maybe they are pausing to regroup. No one believes that they are pausing to retreat, but that's where having the Ukrainians have the capability to begin to push back is very, very crucial right now.
And Kay, is the alliance holding together? And I ask that question very specifically because of Spain and Portugal now expressing some doubts about the cutting back of natural gas, which was asked for by the European Commission in anticipation of Russia cutting back natural gas supplies.
Yeah, I think that has been emphasized again and again here. And we've had the Secretary of the Air Force, we've had military as well as civilian leaders. We all know that there can be no Ukraine fatigue. We must stay on this, and we must help them fight to the end to keep their sovereign nation. However, we know that what is happening in Europe with the cutoffs from Russia, Russia has cut off even Nord Stream 1. They have put it back in, but it's very iffy. We need to build up our reserves to be able to send to our European allies our natural gas. I just think we have capabilities that are not being utilized because of the regulatory environment here, David. And I hope that the president will look at the capabilities that we have to help our European allies to get the natural gas they need to be able to shore up their publics, to keep the Ukrainians in our absolute support system. We can't flag on this. We must help them as they fight for themselves and they take the casualties.
One quick one here at the end, Kay. Do you have a sense from the U.S. government that in fact, they may be moving in your direction on this?
Certainly, I think they're moving in the direction of putting more arms in place and getting our allies to put more arms in place. I don't see yet that they are pivoting on energy to let our reserves help. And taking out of our petroleum reserve is not the way to do it. It is to produce more to send out.
Kay, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. That's Kay Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Coming up, we're going to hear from former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I spoke with Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, earlier today, and asked him what fiscal policy could do to address inflation.
Look, fiscal policy makes a big difference. This is not the time for stimulative fiscal policies like continuing moratoriums on student debt relief. This is not the time for anything that's going to be a big new spending program. In fact, it's the time for short-term deficit reduction. That's why I'm so disappointed that the idea seems to be gaining currency that you shouldn't raise taxes when there's inflation. I actually think that just the right thing to do is to raise taxes right now to take some of the demand out of the economy. We can raise substantial revenue by cutting corporate tax loopholes. In fact, if we don't do it, we're likely to lose what I think was a huge accomplishment for the Biden administration, the Global Tax Cooperation Agreement that Secretary Yellen concluded. We can generate significant revenues simply by enforcing the tax law and taking some of the money out of high-income tax evaders who then go and spend the money, and that'll contribute to reduced inflation as well. So I sure wish we could get past this basically ludicrous economic idea that tax increases are inflationary. It's just not right.
Okay, one quick one here at the end, Larry. We had a lot of earnings out of tech, particularly Snap and also Twitter. They didn't do so well this week. Is that telling us anything broader?
Look, I think what you're seeing in tech is what you kind of always see, which is just when government's getting aroused that something is a source of monopoly power and earning excess profits, that tends to be when it peaks in the marketplace. That's how it was with IBM many years ago. That's how it was with Microsoft. And I think we're seeing some elements of that with these advertisement-supported tech businesses right now.
For more of my interview with Larry Summers, you can watch Wall Street Week tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Bloomberg. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to Stephen Bennett of the Demex Group about what all this heat is costing businesses around the world, and it may be more than just money. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.